Hello, everyone. I'm Ivor Stradarin, and welcome to this retrospective on Ruby Margaret Rouss. I believe everyone in this territory knows Senator Rouss, who served back in the 10th through the 17th legislature of the Virgin Islands. Senator Rouss was and remains to this day in the minds of many people a stalwart in this community. She served as president of our legislature, and she ruled, in fact, with a very firm hand. However, she was a witty person, a person who was loved by very many people in this territory. As for me, Senator Rouss and I had what many people thought was an embattled relationship. We fought many times on many issues on the floor of the legislature. However, once we got off the floor of the legislature, we many times chuckled at the antics that we had engaged in. Senator Rouss referred to me fondly as Ivor or Streety Baby, and I referred to her as Ruby Baby. We got along well, we fought well, but it was always, as I said, on the floor of the legislature. She served this community well. She served in the military with Dwight Eisenhower, and she has did much for this community. I ask you to enjoy this retrospective on my Ruby Baby, the Honorable late Senator Ruby Margaret Rouss.
This is Face to Face, a live public affairs presentation. Tonight we will come face to face with Ruby M. Rouss.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once again to another edition of Face to Face. Tonight, of course, we're happy to have with us Ruby Margaret Rouss, citizen. We've gotten many requests over the years that we've been doing Face to Face in doing a program such as this of personalities in our community. This particular lady that we have here tonight, of course, is admired by some. Sometimes I can say hated by others. I mean, she creates excitement, creates aggravation for some people in our community. And it's just fascinating. While she has been very active politically, I think a lot of you have heard statements and read press releases about Ruby M. Rouss. We want to take a look at Ruby M. Rouss, the lady. What makes her tick? You know, what was her upbringing? Why is she the way she is today? And you'll have an opportunity to talk and meet with Ms. Rouss tonight. First of all, Ruby, I want to welcome you to Face to Face.
Thank you very much, Addie. I'm very pleased to be here.
It's a delight.
And I should not refer to you as Addie. I should refer to you as Senator, Lieutenant Governor, Assistant Commissioner Otley.
Keep it up. Thank you very much. Okay, Ruby, of course, a lot of people have seen pictures of you. You've been on television before. You've been in the news a lot. What is it that makes Ruby Rouss tick? Give us a little background. Where were you born? What was your childhood like? How did you develop into the person that you are today?
Well, Addie, I was born in Christiansted, St. Croix, in the U.S. Virgin Islands, to a very poor but hard-working, honest, respectable parents. My mother was from St. Kitts, Bastille, St. Kitts, and had emigrated to the Virgin Islands. My father's roots were in Barbados, and they married each other in St. John's Anglican Church before I was born.
Okay.
Okay?
The kind of upbringing that they gave you.
Well, along the way, my father, a preacher, an itinerant preacher, came to the Virgin Islands and opened a church called the Christian Mission. And the church attracted my father, and he left St. John's Anglican Church and joined the Christian Mission. My mother resisted it as long as she could, and when she couldn't, she finally went along and also joined the Christian Mission Church. That church later became the Pilgrim Holiness Church, and I think today it's called the Wesleyan Holiness Church. But we grew up in an atmosphere of love, respect for each other, respect for our parents. The fear of God poured it into us, and we just had to be straight kids. That was all there was to it. I remember when I was about 12 years old, my brother and I stole a boat. Well, actually, stole a boat. Where could you go with a boat? We took the boat in an unauthorized fashion, got in it, rode around the quay, you know, the Protestant quay in Christiansted Harbor, and all down by Hams Bay Bluff for the whole day. And of course, the alarm went out that Mr. Watley's boat was stolen. And everybody gathered down to the shore because they knew the culprits would have to come in eventually with the boat. And when my brother and I came ashore, my mother was standing there with a short piece of stick. And she pointed the stick and she said, "March to the fort." And we were marched up to the fort and spread-eagled on the bench. And they handed me 12 because I was older than my brother. He was about 10. I was about 12, and they handed my brother 6. And it stuck with me ever since then that you do not take what doesn't belong to you without permission.
In your early days in growing up, of course, I got it just from that one story. Again, typical kids growing up in St. Croix, getting into the mischief and what have you. Your schooling, how far did you go through the educational system on St. Croix?
Addie, I went as far, I finished the 8th grade in St. Croix, and then I left the Virgin Islands and I went to New York City. And while in New York City, I attended Washington Irving High School. I finished high school, and then I went on to, while I was in the Army, I went on to take college courses, and I'm credited with having completed 2 years of college.
The getting over, you're finishing your high school, going into the service, is this something that you wanted to do?
No, not really. When I was a child, I always was a dreamer of big dreams. I can remember being 12 years old and lying down on the sand and looking out across the water towards St. Thomas and saying to myself, someday I'm going to go beyond that horizon and I'm going to travel all over the world, never knowing how I was going to do it. I also remember we used to get a newspaper that would come down, the Daily News of New York, and it would be passed around from family to family, hand to hand. And I remember reading a feature article in the Sunday section about Oberammergau in the Alps Mountains in Bavaria, and the Passion Play, the famous Passion Play that is put on every 10 years. And I said to myself then, one day I'm going to see the Passion Play. And eventually I joined the Army at 20, and I ended up where I always wanted to go, which was Europe. And I saw the Passion Play in 1950. It had been suspended during the war, but it resumed being acted out in the little town of Oberammergau in 1950 at the close of the war, and I saw it then.
What was your role in the Army?
Well, Addie, to tell you the truth, I went into the Army unskilled. And in those days, if you were black, things were not easy for you in the United States Army. It wasn't easy for you any place in the United States. But you have to give those persons credit who stuck to their guns and changed things. And when I went into the Army, all black women in the Army were assigned to doing menial work. And I was always big and brawny and had these awful big hands that, you know, they're not dainty and feminine. And they look at me, and right away I was suitable for cleaning the grease traps in the kitchen.
Yeah.
And I did that for about 2 weeks, and then I said, no, this is not for me. I didn't come in this Army to clean grease traps. And being a West Indian, I knew that I had, if all the other girls, the other black girls, could not find a way out, I, Ruby Rouss, as a smart West Indian, had to find a way out of that kitchen. And so I struck up acquaintance with a major, and I explained to him that I felt I could do something other than just be a permanent KP. And he gave me a letter to come to his office. I went to his office. They tried me out on a little Jeep, and I could drive because I'd learned to drive at home. And I became a messenger. And in carrying the mail all over Fort Knox, and Fort Knox, let me tell you, at that time had about 40,000 soldiers on it, okay? So there was a lot of places to go with the mail. Every time I came back into the office after distributing the mail, I would sit down at a desk in the back of the room and take my 2 forefingers and start punching the keys on a typewriter. And one day, one of the white girls in the office, and I say white for a particular reason, because Fort Knox, Kentucky at that time was highly segregated, the whole of Kentucky for that matter. And that was the same Kentucky where I had been refused an opportunity to go into a theater because we don't allow Negroes to come into this theater. And yet in that same Kentucky, a white girl took my hands and put them on the rest keys of the typewriter, taught me to look over in a book and type by the touch system. And she also taught me shorthand. And 1 year after I arrived in Fort Knox, Kentucky, my military occupational specialty was changed from messenger to clerk typist. I was transferred to Camp Atterbury, Indiana, and I never stopped climbing the administrative ladder until I ended up at General Eisenhower's headquarters in Paris, France, the only black woman assigned General Eisenhower. The only black person, period.
Yeah. Man
or woman, person. Because later the Pittsburgh Courier came there and they raised 20 kinds of hell, and then they started bringing in additional black persons to be on the part of the headquarters.
The perception that you have in our community today is at some point, you can be a hellraiser, the sergeant, the very hard disciplinarian. Was this developed in the Army?
Well, I think it comes partly from my background, Addie, because my mother was a disciplinarian. She did not permit any slackness in our home, among us as children. She did not, like for instance, she'd allow us to go to play with a neighbor. But her strict rule was at the point where the mother of that family calls the children to eat. You have to leave their yard and you must come home, because as long as you stay in their yard, the mother of that family would feel obligated to offer you something to eat. And we hardly had that much, to share around for the weight of us, the Rouss children, to be thrown on some other family. And it was a rule that we had to obey. As soon as the lady called her children to eat, we had to leave and go home. And that sense of discipline, obedience to orders, has been a part of my life. And then being brought up in a Pentecostal church, you have to pretty much hew the line. And then going into the Army, I mean, I was ready-made to be, tailor-made to be a master sergeant.
Do you perceive that everyone should be this way? Okay, this is some of the
because I'll tell you, I have a niece whom I call my sister, and when she was always a gentle person. She started living with us at the age of 6 months, and we never thought of her as a niece. We always thought of her as a sister, and she was always a very gentle, very ladylike, very, very sweet person. And when she was about 21, she wrote to me to tell me she was at Hunter College in her last year. And she said that they had an officer from the Navy, one from the Army, one from the Air Force, one from the Coast Guard. And the officers were trying their very best to encourage the young soon-to-be graduates to join the military service. And she wanted to know, what should she do? And I think it took me 13 pages to tell her what she should do, which was, don't let me catch her near any part of the military service. And she stayed, and I very foolishly said to her, I promise you that if you remain in college and go on to get your master's degree, I'll give you a trip to Europe. And she shocked me, finished her undergraduate work, went down and took her master's degree at Columbia University Teachers College in science, a very difficult field. And I had to give her a trip to Europe. I mean, it was a real pleasure to do it because I was pleased. But I'm saying that because she was not Army material. She's sweet and gentle and ladylike, and I don't think she could have taken the rough and tumble of the Army. Not the Army I was in. And by the way, that was the straight Army. No beer in the barracks, no women in the barracks, no men in the barracks, that kind of thing, right?
Did you, in your early years, have a family? I mean, were you married?
Addie, let me tell you what happened to me with this marriage situation, okay?
Yeah.
All of my brothers and sisters got married rather early in life. And I had parents that were getting down in years. And at that time, Kings Hill was our place for the the elderly poor.
Okay.
And Kings Hill was such a pest hole at that time that I took an oath to Almighty God that I would never allow my parents to go into Kings Hill. And so I said to myself, all right, everybody is married. If you get married, who's going to take care of Mama and Papa? And I gave up the idea of getting married to take care of my parents until their eyes closed in death. My mother died first. My father died in 57. And I was married on the 22nd day of November, 1957. By the way, the 22nd of November is the same date that Kennedy was killed.
Yes.
So always remember that.
Yeah.
All right? Now, we started out very poor. I had one rank more than he had, one stripe more than he had.
Oh, this was an army man.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
okay.
What else would I
So-
marry? Am I gonna marry a Navy guy?
I'm just asking.
And we had a very wonderful working arrangement.
Yeah.
Okay? He shined the shoes, he shined the brass, he pressed the uniform, I tried to cook, I tried to keep house, and it was a very good arrangement. But one day he said to me, I don't mind shining the brass, I don't mind shining the shoes, I don't mind pressing the uniform, but when I have to stand to attention to talk to you that's carrying it a little too far, goodbye. And with that he left.
Really?
Really.
But
we separated in 63.
yeah.
And I came home to the Virgin Islands, and we would communicate and call each other and so on and so forth. And he'd say, I'm coming down, but I knew he couldn't come because he didn't know where to come, right? He didn't know where to go, right?
Yeah.
And I went back twice, and then I said, well, my things are going to rot in storage, so let me bring my furniture home. And I decided to make a home,
Here in the islands.
remain at home. And of course, you know that somewhere along the way, I succumbed to the blandishments of a lovely social worker who used to say to me, Ruby, you have such a lovely home. Why don't you take some kids in?
Right, that's what I wanted to get to. Excuse me. So you've been, ever since that time, you know, you've adopted several children. They've all done very
I
well.
walked into the Queen Louise home one day, for the sole purpose of getting a little girl to bring her up in the home with my little Ruby, who's really my niece. Okay? And I just went to get this little girl, and when we got there was a little girl who had a deformed hand. And the lady who ran the home said to me, this child has never been taken out of the home since she was brought here at the age of 6 months. She has never been taken out for Christmas, Thanksgiving, a birthday, or nothing. And we'd like to know if you would give her a home. And when they called the little child, she came out holding up her hand like this. Because so many people had been to the home and had examined her hand. Okay. And she came out holding up the hand. And I took that little girl, I made arrangements, you know, to take her in.
Right.
And the first thing I decided was that before she became of school age, she would have that hand taken care of so she wouldn't go to school and they'd call her six-finger Jack and all kind of nonsense, right? Because these things are scarring to a child. And I took her to Dr. McDonald, your Dr. McDonald from over here, and he did a fantastic job on her hand, and nobody knows the difference about the deformity. And I adopted her about a year and a half after I had her in the home, and adopted the other children, and we just had a good family life. And let me tell you, Addie, it's no fun being a stern father figure when you have to be, and a gentle and loving mother figure when you have to be. But I could play that ambivalent role. I could be very sweet and charming and lovely with them, and, you know, and coax them and cajole them and everything. And I could growl at them like a father would, you when they needed it. And they turned out pretty well. One is a marshal, one is a police officer, one is studying psychology, yes, clinical psychology in college, and the other one is studying accounting and is working for an airline in Florida.
That is amazing. I think that's the key, the story that I wanted you to talk about tonight. How you were able to adopt these children, cared for them as if they were your own, developed, they grew, went to school, and very successful today in our community. Okay, we have a number of calls. Good evening, you're on Face to Face.
Good evening. This is Jim Leblow in St. Croix, and I have a two-part question I'd like to address to the former President of the Senate, Mrs. Rouss.
Okay.
Ruby, good evening.
Good evening.
First of all, I'd like to know what your reaction is to the allegations that Senator Lee and Senator Williams have leveled against you, resulting in a subsequent investigation. And the second part, how you feel about the results of that and the involvement of you in that investigation.
Well, sir, first of all, on the first part, the charges leveled at me by Senator Lee has not been Senator Williams, it's been Senator Lee. Those charges were made by Senator Lee first on the 19th day of March on the floor of the legislature on the privileges of the floor. They were repeated again by Senator Lee on the 31st of March on the Doc James show, and repeated again on the 15th of May on the Doc James show. I am not disturbed by Senator Lee's charges because they are without foundation. And for those persons, and quite a number of persons have expressed indignation at the turn of events in that I'm being investigated. And I've suggested to them that they rest easy. I can stand the white heat of investigation, so that I'm not concerned. And on the second part of the question was, how do I feel? Could you repeat it again for me?
And how do you feel about the allegations?
It doesn't trouble me in any way, sir. I haven't lost a moment's sleep over the charge by Senator Lee that I was involved in a conspiracy with Senator Sproul to buy Senator Sproul's father's land. And I haven't lost a minute's sleep over the fact that he says that I haven't paid my income taxes. So that the charges doesn't bother me. I feel that the Virgin Islands Attorney General is standing on solid rock when she asked the team from Boston to investigate all of us, because I don't think it would be fair to investigate the charges which I have made against them and not the ones they have made against me.
Okay, thank you very much for your call. Ruby, what is you've, again, this is just one situation in where you, in terms of government officials, people in the administration, people out of the administration, where you criticize publicly and very harshly. What is it in you that prompts you to do these things, look into these matters, it seems as if you have an awful lot of documentation on individuals. Is it a personal vendetta against these individuals, or you just love good, clean government?
Addie, let me tell you something. It is not a personal vendetta, neither is it an attempt to assassinate anybody's character. I explained to you how I was brought up, and I have explained to you my positions which I've occupied in the Army. I worked for a man named General Eisenhower. General Eisenhower was so straight that he was square like a box. I think you'll remember that when he became president, that General Eisenhower dismissed Sherman Adams because Sherman Adams took a coat which he did not ask anyone for, but which was given to him by a manufacturer in Boston. When you take the oath to uphold the laws of the Virgin Islands and the laws of the United States of America, I think you ought to take your oath seriously. And you go into that legislature or into the governorship or the lieutenant governorship not to break the law or bend the law to suit yourself, but to obey the law and uphold the law, so that those of lesser lights must know that they must obey the law. It is wrong for us to arrest a young boy, pardon me, who snatches a pocketbook with $20 in it, bring him to court, prosecute him, send him to jail. Well, those persons in high office are doing worse.
That, I guess, is the basis. I think it's, we're here, another glass of water for
Thank you.
is what a number of people, ask for on I mean, they question, is this a situation where Ruby Rouss, just having nothing to do, wants to go in and create all this disruption in our community, as some people describe it?
Do you recall when I was president of the legislature?
Yes, I do.
That we were doing a telephone audit?
Mm-hmm.
Do you recall that Mr. Heimer, the controller of the legislature, discovered some 90, with more, I can't remember the exact number, but it was a significant number of calls had been made to a particular number in St. Croix, and that number turned out to be the number where the guard on night duty would use to call for help. But instead of that, he was using it to call my daughter. And in many instances, she called back to him, returned his call, and ran up an enormous bill for the legislature. And when Mr. Heimer brought it to my attention, I didn't quibble about what should be done. I knew my daughter had done something wrong, and she would have to pay for it.
Sure.
And she did have to pay the monies that was owed the legislature for the misuse of the telephone. Now, I'm saying that to tell you that I don't have one standard of conduct for the senators in the legislature and a different standard of conduct for myself. I think that the resources of this government, with something like $254 million, that's our budget, Addy. If the resources of this government were taken care of by those in authority and were used wisely and well, we would not have to be borrowing $30 million from anybody. And having borrowed the $30 million about 3 weeks ago, why are we now talking about borrowing from Hess from next year's revenues? What are we going to do when next year comes?
Those are some of the questions that are going to have to be answered.
And you know what is plaguing us, Addy? Waste, mismanagement, fraud, and corruption.
Good evening. You're on Face to Face.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello, I'd like to ask Ruby a question. Ruby,
Go ahead.
As you and I know, right, the youth will inherit the Virgin Islands sooner or later. So what advice do you have to give to a young individual who has aspirations to become a senator and would like to see the Virgin Islands turn around from the depth that we have fell into today? So I'd like to know that answer to that question, please.
Sir, I think my advice to you would be to work hard. Try your best to get a good education. If your financial condition is such that you cannot get a formal education, read, and then read some more. When you embark on becoming a senator, continue to read, because if many of these senators that we have in the legislature over the years would only understand that they have to put their head to the difficult task of studying the bills and studying the different reports and memoranda and so on that is given to them in order to be knowledgeable. You could not find senators doing the kind of nonsense they're doing. I am saying to you, as an example, that the Chief Legal Counsel, Eric Dawson, wrote the senators a letter dated the 21st of December 1983, telling them that Sidney Lee was in a conflict of interest with his land sale, and saying to them that perhaps it would be wiser if you seek land elsewhere. And even with that kind of good advice, these people on the 6th of February still voted to buy Sidney Lee's land after being told by your counsel that there's a conflict of interest. How do you still march straight ahead, like over the precipice, regardless of what advice they're getting? So I'm saying...
Excuse me.
Go ahead.
You're saying that due to the lack of knowledge that our senators today have and their
inability to want to improve their lack of knowledge, that to a young man today that is trying to increase his possibilities of becoming successful in life and to help his island, he would have to become a person with a vast and abundant of knowledge that could, within itself, become a resource to his island.
I'm not saying that, sir. What I'm saying is this. If you can, get yourself a formal education, because a formal education helps you to think. It is supposed to help you to think. Okay? Now, I'm not saying it does for everybody, because there's a whole lot of PhDs walking around, and the PhD only means pile higher and deeper.
Yeah, I would agree.
But I'm saying, get yourself a formal education if you can. And even though or you may not be able to, or even though you may be able to, form the habit of reading. Read voraciously. Read everything you can put your hand on. Train yourself to read, so that when you become a legislator, it will be automatic that you know you've got to read what is put before you, so that you don't shoot from the hip. You don't vote for things that you don't know what you're voting for.
It's very important. I could, excuse me, back that up by again, insisting on reading. It's so important all over, not only being members of the legislature, but in any facet of life.
Addy, could I add something else for the young man?
Yeah, before we go to the next call.
The two people that comes to my mind immediately as being two of the better prepared senators I've seen is in the 10th legislature, Alexander Augustus Moorhead. Right. Always came to that floor thoroughly prepared, thoroughly aware of what he was going to deal with, and he could even stop some of the foolishness by telling us that this is already on the books and proving it, to keep us from passing bills that, just for the sake of passing it. And in the 14th legislature, the one that I admired very much was Stridiron. Of course, there are many days that if I had a cat o' nine tail, Stridiron would have been beaten with many stripes. But nevertheless, he never came to that floor unless he was thoroughly prepared. And he was one of the better senators.
Right. Okay. Good evening. You're on Face to Face.
Good evening, Miss Rouss.
Good evening, ma'am.
I would like to say I admire you very much, and I really like what you stand for, and I hope you keep up the good works. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am.
Okay. Good evening. You're on Face to Face.
Good evening, Senator Rouss. There are two questions for you. First of all, being a very articulate individual and a very knowledgeable individual about the affairs of government, I would like to ask you, first of all, how do you feel about the situation with the HES workers, the lockout that is going on? And secondly, how do you feel about the recent legislation that was passed to give these workers employment benefits?
Sir, on the first question, I'll tell you how I feel about the lockout at HES. In 1964, there was a strike at Harvey Alumina. And after about 2 weeks of that strike, Governor Ralph M. Paiwanski came down to Harvey Alumina and went into a trailer on site with Leo Harvey, old man Leo Harvey, the founder of the company. And Governor Paiwanski continued to come to that job site until he had hammered out an agreement with Harvey, and that strike was ended. In my opinion, there's much that Governor Juan Louis could have done from the time the strike took the disastrous turn that it did. Before it became acrimonious and bitter, and these raging charges back and forth, Governor Juan Louis should have stepped in and used the prestige and power of his office to bring about some form of settlement between the HES company, Hovick, and the workers. Now, the question as to how do I feel about the strikers getting the money, my feelings are ambivalent for the simple reason that I know what it is to be unemployed. And I know with those people getting $60 a week, they're just barely making it, if they're making it at all. So that I can see the need for them to get some sort of a stipend from some quarter. But when you listen to the Commissioner of Labor and what he has said, you wonder where this is all going to end. I am still saying that, in my opinion, if Governor Juan Louis would go to New York and sit down with Mr. Leon Hess, and let me say this, sir, Governor Juan Louis sat down with Mr. Leon Hess and Mr. Everett Birch across a table in Government House. That's Governor Juan Louis, William Blum, the attorney for Louis, Wisby, the other attorney, and Stephanus O'Reilly, the budget director. And they sat down with Mr. Hess in Government House and took an otherwise very good agreement that would have given us $30 million the first year and $20 million every year after that. And they threw that in the wastebasket and said they were negotiating. So if he could negotiate away a guaranteed $20 million a year, he surely should be able to sit down with Mr. Hess and hammer out an agreement with Hess on the strike situation with those workers. Because I'm saying that if the trend continues, we are going to be in an even more serious financial bind.
Yeah, but Ruby, don't you give consideration to the fact that the union, is bargaining, with Hess? I think Lieutenant Governor Brady at one point tried to get both sides to get the agreement still has to come between the unionized workers or the leadership and Hess, and not necessarily the government of the Virgin Islands.
The agreement had to come between the unionized workers and the Virgin Islands Labor Union at that time. Senator Otley's old union, right. Senator Earl B. Otley's old union? Okay. But I'm saying that Governor Paiwanski sat down with Mr. Leo Harvey, and whatever he did or didn't do, I cannot tell you because I was not privy to those conversations. But he hammered out an agreement that ended a disastrous strike.
And so you're saying that the governor should use the
prestige and power of his office and sit down with Leon Hess and Everett Birch, and he will get something done. If he can't do it, he should ask me to do it, and I'll get Everett in a corner, and Ruby, I'll bet you we'll get it done.
Please, Ruby. Good evening. You're on Face to Face.
Yes, I would like to ask Ms. Rouss, do you think it's fair that the governor should limit water after the taxpayers have been paying and the legislature has appropriated funds to assist WAPA, and after getting the ID plants online, that the governor should pass an order to cut off the water supply to the island and limit such water supply to the hotels, which is detrimental to the businesses, after helping with our taxes and even paying our water bills, that he still would cut it off, forcing the hotels to buy water. Do you think that is fair to put them in a greater deficit in these very trying economic times?
Ma'am, I think it's gone beyond the point of fear or fairness or unfairness. I'm going to say something to you now that you may not believe, but I'm going to say it, and it's the truth, so help me God. You have 6 IDE plants, 2 large ones and a small one on St. Thomas, 1 large and 2 small on St. Croix. And although I had in the first go-round voted against the IDE plants, I voted for them in the second go-round, because I was convinced that the Israeli desalination engineering, IDE, knew what they were doing. Those plants have lived up to the standards that the manufacturers said they would do, so that there is no question that the water is being produced. There's no question about that. The IDE plants are working and they can produce the water. Whenever anybody tells you that the reason they are rationing water is because the more water they pump, the further they get behind because they're subsidizing the water, I am saying to you that they're telling you something out of whole cloth. And I'm saying to you that the government is headed for a rude awakening, very, very shortly, because the government of the Virgin Islands has $10 million, repeat, $10 million on the streets, uncollected. And if they would collect the monies which are on the street, and I have seen a letter, a memorandum from former Commissioner Arnold M. Golding, urging them that if they cannot collect the monies over the public works for the water, to hire a private firm, a private collection firm, but get that money in off the streets. And I'm saying that if they would collect the monies, they would have the money to pay WAPA, and if they paid WAPA, you could have water flowing through the lines.
Yeah, okay. That's, I think that's the bottom line, what it comes down to. The people who are using the water, that are being billed for the water, I couldn't believe we've got $10 million out on the street. People have not paid their bills, and it's going to be a problem. Okay, we just have limited time, so a few more calls. Good evening, you're on Face to Face.
Good evening, Miss Rose. I would like to ask you a question. Are you running for Senate?
She can't answer that question on this particular program, okay?
Okay, thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. Good evening, you're on Face to Face.
Blessed.
Hello?
Hello?
Yes, go ahead, please.
I would like to know, yesterday was the first 149 years of black man's emancipation in the Caribbean, slaves. And I would like to know what is Miss Rouss' message to all slave children here in the Virgin Islands, who is still in captivity and awaiting that Freedom Redemption International repatriation. What is her message to us, the slave children in the Virgin Islands?
Sir, I'd like to ask you if you consider yourself a slave.
If I do consider myself a slave?
Yes.
Well, through colonialism and imperialism, yes, I am.
Colonialism and imperialism where? Throughout the Caribbean or in the Virgin Islands, or where?
Through the teachings that the black slave children has been, taught.
Well, sir, I'm going to tell you this now, okay? I don't subscribe to your theory about slavery and imperialism and colonialism, etc., etc., etc. I'm going to tell you something, sir. There is an ethnic group of people in this world known as Jews. And the Jews were in slavery in Egypt, that ancient land known as Egypt, where they have the Sphinx and the pyramids, and they were enslaved there. And Moses went down to Egypt, as you know, and freed the Jews. And the Jews have forever been subjected to discrimination, to segregation, to insults, to programs, and the word programs means many times in a country that sweep into the area where they live and wipe them all out. But the Jews have not allowed all of the hardships that they have suffered to stop them from being where they are today. I think if we should not forget our past, but we ought to look to the future and stop wallowing in this nonsense about slavery and our slaves, and start reminding our children that they can become lawyers and doctors. And we have seen a black man run for president of the United States, the greatest country on this earth. And you cannot tell me that we should spend time talking about 150 years ago. Let us move on to the future.
Very good. Okay, good evening. You're on Face to Face.
Yeah, good evening. I have no questions of you, Mrs. Rouss. I just want to let you know that I hope that God would give you good health and strength and spare your life so that you can continue to serve these islands in the way you're doing. I think you're doing a wonderful job, and there's a great future ahead for you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your comments. All right.
Thank you, ma'am.
Good evening. You're on Face to Face.
Yes, Senator, following up on the previous question in regards to the Hess lockout and to the unemployment benefits for the HES workers. Now, you've said that the government, the governor in some way or the other has failed, and from what I gather, the HES workers. I haven't heard anything in your remarks about the legislature as such. Now, we have to remember one thing. The legislature is the ones that make the laws. If the governor was acting upon what laws was on the books, don't you feel that the legislature in some way had some responsibility in order to assist these workers, and that they were coming assisting at the last minute, not even listening to, as you say, Commissioner Upson of the Department of Labor, as to how this particular legislation that they passed is going to affect the Virgin Islands government? How do you feel about that?
Well, sir, you're asking me if the legislature is responsible for the position in which the HES workers find themselves, and I don't see where the legislature is to blame. First of all, the HES agreement that we got from Governor Juan Louis was an agreement that was cut and dried, and repeatedly, as I can show you in the transcript, we were told that we could not even change a comma. Senator Sproul, Gilbert Sproul, attempted to amend that agreement, and Senator Sproul's amendment lost because we could not even change a single comma, because the law says we are not permitted in the legislature to negotiate contracts or leases. We can either vote them up or vote them down. And I don't see where voting, it was a case, sir, where Governor Juan Louis had waited until the last minute. He submitted that legislation to us, I think the 5th of May, and Hess had indicated that he was going to close the plant and move off by the 9th. And I'm telling you, sir, that I know that steps were being taken to close that plant. So that the legislature was backed into a corner, and they practically had to agree for a lousy decision in place of the good one that the Hess Oil Advisory Committee had put together. And as for whether or not the legislature has any role to play now, they have played the role of getting you all a stipend through the unemployment insurance, and I think that's about the most that they can do. They cannot get Mr. Hess to a bargaining table. It has to be done by the governor.
Good evening. You're on Face to Face.
Good evening.
Good evening. You're on Face to Face.
Hello. I'd just like to say to Senator Rouss that I agree with the statements before to the gentleman that called about slavery. First. Secondly, I don't always agree with maybe her reasons. People have said that her reasons for doing what she does are other than honorable. Whatever her reasons are, I do believe that she tells the truth, and I want to thank her for that, and hope that she will be able to continue.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, that's one of the perceptions that, I talked about in terms of how people perceive you and why you do certain things, why you raise so much hell, why do you criticize so much. And as a result of and I guess there are a number of things, but can you, off the top of your head, give us some examples of some hell raising that you've done in the past that resulted in either funds refunded to the government or action taken that has benefited the government of the Virgin Islands?
Well, Adi, right off the top of my head, I can tell you this, okay? Mm-hmm. In the legislature, when I took over as president, we had a system where every senator was calling all over the world at will, all right? And I went back into the records and I made the senators who had these enormous bills that were run up pay back to the government the money which had wrongfully been paid for their personal calls. I also made sure that all senators who were traveling and taking their ham sandwich with them to a banquet, that they had to pay the way of their ham sandwich, but they weren't going to get the legislature to pay it. And the last thing that I can think of is, after my encounter of the third kind with Commissioner Schneider and the Cooperative Effort Unit, yes. I want to tell you that the very next day, they started cleaning and scrubbing that place. And I understand that you could eat a dumpling off the floor in the CEU now, after the hell I raised about the condition of the CEU in the Nude Hansen Hospital.
I tell you, you get action, for sure. Good evening, you're on Face to Face.
Yes, I'd just like to make a comment.
Sure.
Senator Rouss is there. Of course, she's not in public life anymore, but I hope she'd continue to be in public life, because at least she has kept everything together, and I'm certain that quite a number of other people would like to see her continue keeping everybody straight somewhat.
Keeping them on their toes.
That's correct.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for calling. Good evening. You're on Face to Face.
Yes, I'd like to speak to Mrs. Rouss.
Go right ahead.
First, I'd like to congratulate her on her record of, like you say, keeping the people aware of what's happening, plus keeping the officials in the government somehow or another trying to toe the line, all right? But I don't like to bring up the same question over and over again. But this Hess problem, I just want to make a comment first, then I have a question.
Okay, go ahead.
We realize what Hess is. Do we know what Hess is? And do we realize what the Virgin Islands is? Can we juxtapose Hess and the Virgin Islands? A multi-billion-dollar corporation and 100,000 people, right? Here on the Virgin Islands. Now, this is one of the giants of the world, industrially speaking. Now, here's what I want to know. How is it that this firm can lock workers out of their plant with flimsy excuses? Lock out, I remember years ago we had what we called civics in school. And lockout, we learned that lockouts were illegal. When the employer locked the employees out of its plant, it was illegal.
Get the question,
now,
the question.
The question is, how can the National Labor Relations Board and all the rest of the people say that there's nothing they can do about Hess's lockout?
Ruby?
Flimsy excuses for their lockout.
Well, sir, first of all, if the National Labor Relations Board has said that Hess had done nothing illegal, what do you want Ruby Rouss to say? I am saying to you, sir, again, that before it reached the state where it is now, which is a bitter, acrimonious face-off between Hess and the workers, that something should have been done by the government, by the governor, to bring about a peaceful settlement of that strike. Now, I do not feel that it is right that the men should be asked to give up their right to grieve. I don't think that is right. But just by talking on the surface without having read anything about it, with just what you read in the newspaper, that the men are being asked to give up their right to grieve, that does not sound right to me. But I'm saying that something could have been done before it reached this stage of something like 3 months now these men have been out.
Right, it's a real problem. Good evening, you're on Face to Face.
Good evening.
Hi.
I would just like to commend former Senator Ruby Rouss and the wonderful job she's doing in our community. I think she should just keep up the good works and continue to speak out on the issues that most people seem to put their, just seem to neglect, you know. And like I said, I just want to thank her for the wonderful job she's doing, and may God bless her.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening, you're on Face to Face.
I have the same feeling as the person who just spoke, although I can't state it quite as eloquently. First time I met Ruby, I helped her on an airplane, and I told her this is not the first time I helped her. I'd like to say that the talk describing her background is a real inspiration.
It is.
I have one worry, though. Back a while, she made it known that she was leaving these islands, and I wonder what the situation is.
Leaving the islands?
Yes, I think there was some talk about her leaving. I hope it's not true.
Well, let's get it squared away right now. Ruby, at any time did you indicate you were going to leave the islands again?
Well, I was on the Dr. James show one Saturday, and in a fit of utter frustration and anger and fury at the fact that we could have a situation where someone who is the resident agent for a company could also be on the board of governors of that company, dealing, a board of governors of an authority that is dealing with that company. And in a fit of pique, I said something to the effect that I sometimes feel that I should just pack my things and get the devil off of this island. Because I know that things don't go this wrong in other small communities. I'm not talking about New York and New Jersey and Chicago, you know, where we always have graft and corruption and mismanagement and everything else. And I did say I was going to leave. However, I would say that I'd been persuaded by a number of people, because I never had so many people streaming through my house to come to tell me that they hoped that I wouldn't really leave. And I sort of backed away from that position.
That's good, Ruby. We need you here, so please stay.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. A few more calls. Good evening. You're on Face to Face.
Yes, Alex speaking, Ruby Rouss.
Go right ahead, sir.
I am concerned about the way these 5,000 people in the Virgin Islands are treated with the dome insurance, which the Lieutenant Governor, who is in charge of the insurance, did nothing absolutely about dome until it came to a crisis. And if you pay the money, $1,000 to insure your car within a month, now they're telling you have to go back and find $1,000 or other $1,000 to pay for your insurance. What do you think can be done about that?
I don't know what can be done about it, but I know what should have been done about it, because it was back in June of last year when it was obvious to a lot of us that Dome was running into problems, because it was around June when complaints began to come in that I had a claim that was settled in the court or settled out of court, and Dome must have paid me, and Dome didn't pay me. And something should have been done then. But I would like to say this much to the listening audience tonight. I know for a fact that persons in authority who should have taken stern measures with Dome to see that Dome was brought into line were busy being entertained by the principals of Dome in faraway places with strange sounding names. Other than that, I don't know what to tell you to do about Dome.
Let me ask you something, Ruby. How do you get all this information?
Well, you know what happens, Addie? I say something, which I never speak unless I have the records, right?
Right, that's
basically. And when I have the records and I speak, someone listening will call me and say, Senator Rouss, I heard you tonight. And I heard you when you said that Addie Otley was doing such and such and such a thing and it was illegal. And I want to tell you something else that Senator Addie Otley is doing that you may not know about. And when they finish telling me, I say, okay, I'm glad for the information, but back me up with records.
Yeah.
And sure enough, the records come. Then I've got you where I want you, Addie.
Oh, you're too much. Okay, we have time. Leslie, do we have time for one more telephone call? Yeah, okay, one final call. Good evening, you're on Face to Face.
Good evening.
Hi.
I don't have a question for our good senator.
Okay.
But I would just like to commend her for her courage and conviction, and certainly to indicate to her that if the administration had seen it fitting and proper to use us so that we could apply our training that we got in the military, I am sure that our government would be in a much better position. But keep up the good works, and we will prevail in the future. It's not too late.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, that's all the time we have for Face to Face tonight. A different approach, taking an individual such as Ruby Margaret Rouss and having her as our guest tonight. The lady, not the politician, but she still was able to get a little side of that in.
But
it was a delight, having you.
But Addie, I think that you have to be careful. I am quite often called the politician. I'm often called the senator. But no one except you, Addie, has ever had the nerve to call me a lady.
We're
different. I'm going to let you get away with murder. You know why? Because when I had you in that hotel room asking you to be my lieutenant governor, you would not say yes, and you are responsible for the mess we're in today, because you and I would have made an unbeatable team.
You see that? You can't take a joke. That was a joke. Ladies and gentlemen, good night. We'll see you next week. From all of us here at Channel 12.
Good night. Thank you.